In 1933, a single dollar had to feed entire families for days, but what they actually ate might shock you. These weren't just cheap meals. They were survival strategies, born in one of the hardest times in history. From strange combinations to forgotten recipes that stretched every last cent, people found ways to stay alive when food was scarce and hope was scarcer. Some of these meals sound unbelievable today. Others might feel uncomfortably familiar. So what did families really eat when money disappeared? And how did they turn almost nothing into something that kept them going? You wake up before sunrise, not because you want to, but because hunger doesn't let you sleep any longer. The house is quiet, except for the faint creak of wooden floors. There's no fridge humming, no stocked pantry waiting, just a small tin, a few scraps, and one question that repeats every single morning. How do you make this last one more day? In 1933, this wasn't a story. It was daily life for millions of families. A single dollar didn't mean comfort. It meant survival. It meant stretching, sacrificing, and sometimes going without. But what's surprising isn't just how little people had, it's how creative they became with it. Because when food is limited, creativity becomes your most valuable ingredient. Some families relied on what they called stretch meals, dishes designed not to satisfy hunger completely, but to delay it. A pot of thin soup might sit on the stove all day, with water added again and again to make it last. Each time someone took a bowl, it tasted slightly weaker, but it still felt like something. And sometimes, something was enough to keep going. One of the most common meals was a simple combination of bread and whatever could be found to go with it. But even bread wasn't guaranteed. Flour had to be rationed carefully. People learned to bake using substitutes, mixing in cheaper grains or stretching dough further than it was meant to go. The result wasn't always good. Sometimes it was dense, sometimes bitter, but it filled the stomach, and that was the goal. And then there were the combinations that today might seem strange, even unappetizing. Imagine boiling vegetables until they lost almost all flavor, then adding a pinch of salt if you had it, or mixing leftovers from days before into one pot, hoping the flavors wouldn't clash too badly. People didn't have the luxury of choosing what tasted good. They chose what kept them alive. But here's where it gets interesting. Not all poor meals were completely lacking. Some families discovered ways to turn the simplest ingredients into something surprisingly comforting. A small amount of fat could transform an entire dish. A single onion, cooked slowly, could add depth to an otherwise bland meal. These tiny details made a difference not just physically, but emotionally. Because food wasn't just about survival. It was about holding on to a sense of normal life. Children still needed to feel like they were eating a real meal. Parents often went without, quietly giving up their portion so their kids wouldn't notice the shortage. And that's something you don't see in recipes. You see it in stories. Stories of mothers who mastered the art of making nothing look like something. Stories of fathers who worked long hours on empty stomachs just to bring home a few cents more. And stories of families who sat together at the table, pretending everything was okay even when it clearly wasn't. But here's the part that surprises most people. Some of the meals from that time didn't disappear. They evolved. They changed slightly, adapted over time, and quietly made their way into modern kitchens without most people realizing where they came from. Dishes that were once born out of desperation are now seen as budget-friendly or even comfort food. But behind those labels is a history most people never think about. A history of struggle, resilience, and survival. And the deeper you go into these meals, the more you start to see a pattern. It wasn't just about food. It was about mindset. People learned how to think differently about resources. Nothing was wasted. Every crumb had value. Leftovers weren't optional. They were expected. Even scraps were repurposed into something usable. And this way of thinking created habits that lasted generations. Even today, you might recognize some of these ideas in your own home-saving leftovers. Stretching meals, finding creative ways to use what you have. But in 1933, this wasn't a trend. It was a necessity. Now imagine living like that every single day. No shortcuts, no quick deliveries, no backup plan. Just you, your family, and whatever you could manage to put together. And yet, people survived. Not easily, not comfortably. But they made it through. And that raises a powerful question. What can we learn from them today? Because while times have changed, the idea of making the most out of limited resources is still relevant. In fact, it might be more relevant than ever. So as we continue, you're going to see some of the actual meals people relied on. Some simple, some surprising, and some that might completely change the way you think about cheap food. But more importantly, you're going to understand the stories behind them. Because once you know the story, the food feels different. And the next time you see a simple meal, you might realize it carries more history than you ever imagined. If you want to explore more stories like this, real moments from history that still connect to our lives, make sure you stay with us. Check out the next video waiting for you on the channel. Because this is just the beginning. Before the next meal even begins, there's already a quiet calculation happening in the mind. How long can this last? And what can be sacrificed today so there's still something left tomorrow? In 1933, every decision around food carried weight. Sometimes the smallest choice could decide whether a family felt full or went to bed hungry. By midday, the hunger felt different. Not sharp anymore, but heavy, slower, almost like your body had learned not to expect too much. One of the most talked about survival habits from that time was how people stretched ingredients far beyond their original purpose. A single potato wasn't just a side dish, it could become the base of an entire meal. Sliced thin, boiled down, and seasoned with whatever. It wasn't about taste, it was about volume. The goal was to make it feel like more than it actually was. And sometimes, it worked. There were also meals built almost entirely on imagination. People learned to recreate the idea of expensive food without actually having it. Dishes were named after things families couldn't afford, meat-based meals that contained no meat at all. This was survival psychology, because when children heard the name of a familiar dish, they felt a sense of normalcy. It gave families something to hold on to. But not all meals were comforting. Some were difficult to accept. Scraps that would normally be thrown away became essential. Peels, ends, leftover bits, everything had a purpose. After boiling vegetables, the water itself became a base for soup. It carried whatever nutrients and flavor remained. Nothing was discarded, because nothing could be. And yet, there's something unexpectedly human about it. In the middle of all this struggle, people still tried to make food feel meaningful. They plated it carefully. They shared it equally. They sat together. Because eating wasn't just about survival. It was about connection. One family would divide a single meal into smaller portions, spacing them out across the day so it felt like they were eating more often. But by spreading it out, they created the illusion of routine. And routine brings comfort even in the hardest conditions. Then there were the moments when something rare happened, when a family managed to get access to a slightly better ingredient, maybe a bit of sugar, or even fresh produce. These weren't everyday occurrences. They were events. And when they happened, everything changed. But those moments didn't last. Reality always returned. And with it came the need to adapt again. Within a short time, families developed an instinct for survival cooking. They didn't need recipes, they understood patterns. Some of the meals created during this period were passed down because they carried meaning. They reminded people of strength. Modern adaptations are softer, more refined. They taste better, look better, but they don't carry the same urgency. Because urgency can't be recreated. It can only be experienced. And in 1933, that urgency was constant. Even something as simple as a crumb on the table wasn't ignored. It was picked up, used, respected. Now imagine sitting at that table. The portions are small, the flavors are simple, but there's a quiet understanding this is enough for today. The truth is, the definition of valuable food changes depending on what you haven't, what you don't. Keep watching, because what comes next might completely change the way you look at a basic meal. If you're curious to see how these habits connect to modern choices, there's another story waiting for you on the channel. As the days stretched on, something subtle began to change, not just in what people ate, but in how they understood food itself. Hunger has a way of reshaping priorities. Things that once felt ordinary slowly became valuable, and things that once felt essential quietly disappeared. In 1933, the idea of expensive food wasn't about luxury brands or fine dining. It was much simpler and, somehow, much more powerful. Expensive food meant anything that was out of reach. A piece of fresh meat, a full glass of milk, even a handful of ripe fruit could feel like something distant, almost unreal. And that distance created a kind of longing. Families would talk about these foods, not as something they had, but as something they remembered. Meals from better times became stories at the table. Someone might describe how food used to taste richer, fuller, more satisfying. And for a moment, just hearing about it brought a sense of comfort. But then the moment would pass, and reality would return in the form of another simple, stretched meal. What's fascinating is how people responded to this gap between memory and reality. Instead of giving up, they adapted in ways that were practical and emotional. They didn't just cook food, they recreated experiences. A simple dish could be prepared in a way that made it feel special, even if ingredients were basic. A little extra time spent cooking, a slightly different method, even the act of sitting together and treating the meal with importance changed how it felt, because sometimes the experience mattered more than the ingredients. But there were also moments when the contrast became impossible to ignore. Imagine a child seeing something they haven't tasted in months, or even years. Maybe it's being sold in a market, or carried by someone passing by. The smell alone is enough to trigger something deep, a memory, a craving, and yet it remains out of reach. That kind of moment leaves a mark. It teaches patience, but it also teaches acceptance. And over time, people began to redefine what good food meant. It wasn't about richness anymore. It wasn't about variety. It was about reliability. If a meal could be made consistently, if it could be counted on, then it became valuable, no matter how simple it was. This shift in thinking led to some of the most resourceful food habits of the time. Families focused on what could be repeated. Meals that used the same base ingredients became common not because people wanted repetition, but because it reduced uncertainty. If you knew you could make something again tomorrow, it brought a sense of control. And control, in a time like that, was everything. But repetition came with its own challenges. Eating similar meals day after day could wear down morale. So people found small ways to create variation, a pinch of something different, a slightly altered method. Even changing the order of meals throughout the day made a difference. These weren't big changes, but they mattered, because they broke the feeling of sameness. And in a time when so much felt uncertain, even a small difference could lift the mood. Then there were the truly unexpected moments, the ones that didn't happen often, but stayed in memory for years. A neighbor sharing something extra, a small opportunity to earn a bit more money, a rare chance to buy an ingredient that hadn't been seen in months. These moments turned ordinary days into something unforgettable. Meals became celebrations, even if they were still modest by any modern standard. And that's where the emotional side of food becomes impossible to ignore. Because when you've gone without for so long, even the simplest improvement feels extraordinary. A slightly thicker soup, a fuller plate, a taste that feels just a bit closer to what you remember. These details might seem small, but in that moment, they meant everything. At the same time, there were foods that people turned to, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. Foods that required a certain mindset to accept. Foods that, in another time, would have been ignored completely. But necessity changes perception. What once seemed strange slowly became normal. And over time, these foods developed their own place in daily life. Some were practical, others were purely about survival. But all of them shared one thing: they existed because people refused to give up. And that resilience is what defines this period. It's not just about what people ate. It's about how they adapted, how they endured, and how they found ways to keep going even when the situation felt overwhelming. Because survival isn't just physical, it's mental. It's the ability to wake up each day and try again, even when the outcome is uncertain. And food played a central role in that process. It gave structure to the day. It created moments of pause. It offered something to look forward to, even if that something was small. Now, as you think about these meals, it's worth asking yourself something. What actually makes food valuable? Is it the price, the ingredients, the taste, or is it the context in which it's eaten? Because in 1933, value had very little to do with money, and everything to do with meaning. A simple meal, shared with family, prepared with care, and stretched with intention, could hold more value than something expensive, but taken for granted, and that idea still carries weight today. Because even now, in a completely different world, the way we think about food is shaped by what we believe we have. So as this story continues, we're going to step even deeper into the reality of those meals, into the combinations that might surprise you, the choices that might challenge your expectations, and the moments that reveal just how far people were willing to go to make $1 last. Stay with this, because what comes next isn't just about survival, it's about transformation. There's more waiting for you right here on the channel. As the weeks turned into months, something even more surprising began to happen. What once felt temporary started to feel permanent. The idea that things would go back to normal slowly faded, and in its place came a new reality. This was normal now. And when that realization settled in, the way people approached food changed again. It wasn't just about stretching meals anymore. It became about building a system, something predictable, something dependable, something that could carry a family through, not just a few days, but indefinitely. This is where some of the most unusual food routines took shape. Meals were no longer planned around preference. They were built around survival logic. What lasted longest? What could be reused? What could be divided the most times? These questions replaced everything else, and sometimes the answers led to combinations that would seem almost impossible today. Imagine a pot that never fully emptied. Each day, a small amount was taken out and something else was added back in. A handful of whatever was available, a scrap saved from earlier, a bit of water to keep it going. Over time, the contents changed constantly, but the purpose stayed the same. Keep it alive, so it keeps you alive. It wasn't a recipe, it was a cycle. And while it might sound unappetizing, it served a powerful purpose. It removed uncertainty. As long as that pot existed, there was always something. That something might not taste great. It might not even feel like a proper meal, but it was enough to get through another day. And in 1933, that was everything. But not all strategies were this extreme. Some families focused on mastering a small number of reliable meals dishes that could be made quickly, consistently, and with minimal ingredients. These meals became the backbone of daily life. Over time, people became incredibly skilled at preparing them. Small techniques made a big difference. Cooking something just a little longer to bring out more flavor. Combining ingredients in a specific order to make them feel more filling. Even the way food was served could change how satisfying it felt. These details weren't written down anywhere. They were learned through experience, through trial and error, through necessity, and they were passed on quietly from one person to another. Because in times like this, knowledge was just as valuable as food itself. Then there was the emotional side, the part that doesn't show up in ingredients or methods, but in moments. Moments when someone chose to give their portion to another. Moments when a meal was shared beyond the family, even when there wasn't enough to go around. Moments when people came together, not because they had plenty, but because they understood what it meant to have nothing. These moments defined the experience just as much as the food did. And they revealed something important. Survival wasn't just individual. It was shared. Communities played a role. Neighbors helped when they could. People exchanged small items, small favors, small portions, anything that could make a difference. Because even the smallest help mattered. But there were also limits. Not everyone could give. Not everyone had extra. And in those situations, families had to rely entirely on their own ability to adapt. This is where the concept of strange foods becomes even more real. Because when options run out, the definition of food expands. Ingredients that once felt optional became essential. Flavors that once felt unusual became familiar. People learned to accept textures, tastes, and combinations they had never imagined before. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And over time, these foods lost their strangeness. They became part of routine, part of identity, part of survival. It's easy to look back now and focus only on how unusual these meals were. But in that moment, they weren't unusual at all. They were normal. And that's what makes this history so powerful, because it shows how flexible human behavior can be when pushed to the edge, how quickly we adapt, how deeply we endure, and how something as simple as a meal can carry so much meaning. Now imagine sitting at that table again. The portions haven't changed much. The ingredients are still limited, but something feels different. There's less fear in the room. Not because the situation has improved, but because the people in it they've learned, they've adjusted, they've found a rhythm. And that rhythm creates a kind of quiet strength, a belief that no matter what comes next, they'll find a way to handle it, because they always have. And that belief shows up in the smallest details. In the way food is prepared, in the way it's shared, in the way people speak to each other at the table. There's a sense of resilience that's subtle but undeniable, and it's built on everything they've been through. As we move deeper into this story, we begin to see not just how people survived, but how they transformed, how they took limitation and turned it into structure, how they took scarcity and turned it into discipline, and how, even in the hardest conditions, they managed to create something that felt like stability. Because survival isn't just about getting through the day. It's about building something that can carry you through the next one, and the next, and the next. And that's exactly what these families did. But the next part of this story reveals something even more unexpected. Because while many meals were built around necessity, a few became something more. They became symbols. Symbols of hope. Symbols of memory. Symbols of a time that, despite everything, people refused to let define them completely. So stay with this, because what comes next isn't just about what people are teats, about what they held on to. And if you're starting to see echoes of these habits in today's world, you're not alone. As time moved forward, something even deeper began to take shape. Food was no longer just about getting through the day. It became a quiet symbol of identity. Not identity in the way we think of it now, but something more personal, more grounded. It reflected how a family survived, how they adapted, and what they held on to when everything else felt uncertain. Because by this point, people weren't just reacting anymore. They were developing their own ways of doing things. One family might rely heavily on simple grain-based meals, finding ways to stretch them into different forms throughout the week. Another might focus on soups that could be adjusted daily depending on what was available. Some became experts at making the same base meal feel slightly different each time, even if the ingredients barely changed. And over time, these methods became habits. Habits turned into routines, and routines became something close to tradition. It's a strange thought, but some of the meals created during this time weren't just remembered. They were repeated long after conditions improved, not because they were necessary anymore, but because they carried meaning. They reminded people of what they had endured, and more importantly, what they had overcome. But while some families found a rhythm, others still struggled to keep up. Not every day went according to plan. There were moments when supplies ran lower than expected, when a meal didn't stretch as far, when the balance tipped just enough to create real uncertainty again. And in those moments, the emotional weight returned. Because no matter how strong someone became, the possibility of not having enough never fully disappeared. That's what made even the smallest success feel significant. A meal that lasted longer than expected. A combination that worked better than usual. A day when everyone felt just a little more satisfied. These weren't small victories. They were proof that adaptation was working. And that proof mattered, because it reinforced something powerful. The idea that even in limitation, there was still control. But alongside these victories, there were also choices that people didn't talk about often. Quiet decisions made behind the scenes. Adjustments that ensured others wouldn't feel the full impact of scarcity. Parents, especially, became incredibly skilled at this. They learned how to shift portions without making it obvious. How to take less without drawing attention. How to present a meal in a way that made it look complete, even when it wasn't. Because maintaining a sense of normalcy wasn't just comforting, it was necessary. Children needed to feel stability. They needed to believe that things were okay, even when they weren't. And food played a central role in that illusion. A carefully prepared plate could do more than feed the body. It could protect the mind. And that's something that often goes unnoticed when we look back at this period. We focus on the scarcity, the struggle, the unusual foods. But beneath all of that was a constant effort to preserve dignity. Because even in the hardest conditions, people didn't want to feel like they had lost everything. They held on to routines, manners, and small traditions at the table. They still shared meals. They still paused before eating. They still treated food with respect. And that respect carried meaning. It was a way of saying, this still matters. We still matter. Now, as you think about the idea of strange foods, it becomes clear that the strangeness wasn't really in the ingredients, it was in the situation. Take the same meal and place it in a different context, and it feels completely different. What once felt like survival might now feel like simplicity. What once felt like necessity might now feel like choice. And that shift in perspective changes everything. Because it shows that value isn't fixed. It changes based on circumstance. And in 1933, value was shaped by one simple question. Does this help us get through the day? If the answer was yes, then it mattered. No matter how simple, no matter how unusual, no matter how far it was from normal. And that mindset created a kind of strength that's hard to describe. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady, reliable, enduring. It showed up in the way people approached each day, not with certainty, but with determination. A willingness to try again, to adjust again, to find another way. And food was at the center of that process. It wasn't just fuel, it was structure, it was comfort. It was proof that something could still be created, something could still be shared, something could still be enough. As this story continues, we begin to see how these habits didn't just help people survive the moment they shaped the future. Because the lessons learned during this time didn't disappear when conditions improved. They stayed. They influenced how people cooked, how they saved, how they thought about waste, and how they valued what they had. Even generations later, traces of these ideas can still be found. In the way meals are planned, in the way leftovers are used, in the way people instinctively try to make things last just a little longer. But perhaps the most powerful part of this story isn't the food itself. It's what the food represents: resilience, adaptation, and the quiet determination to keep going, no matter how limited the resources may be. So as we move into the next part, we're going to explore the final layer of this experience, the moments that stayed with people, the memories tied to specific meals, the feelings attached to certain flavors, and the way something as simple as a $1 meal became a lasting symbol of survival. Stay with this, because the final part brings everything together in a way that might change how you see even the simplest food on your plate. Years later, when life had changed and tables were fuller again, many people still remembered those meals, not because they were delicious, but because they carried the weight of everything that had happened. A simple bowl, a plain slice, a modest plate, these became reminders of a time when every bite mattered. And memory has a strange way of preserving what struggle felt like. A person might forget the exact ingredients, forget the measurements, forget how the meal was prepared, but they remember the feeling. They remember what it meant to sit down and hope the food would be enough. They remember the silence at the table, the careful portions, the quiet gratitude for even the smallest amount. Because hunger leaves an imprint, and so does survival. That's why some meals from that era were remembered with emotion long after hardship ended. Not because they were special in the traditional sense, but because they symbolized endurance. They represented nights that families got through together, days that seemed impossible but still passed. And those memories transformed ordinary food into something deeply personal. Imagine tasting a meal years later that reminds you of that time. The flavor alone could bring back everything: the room, the people, the uncertainty, the relief. That's the power of association. And it reveals something important. Food is never just food. It carries emotion, it carries memory, it carries meaning. For the families who lived through 1933, certain meals became emotional landmarks. They marked hardship, yes, but they also marked resilience. A meal that once symbolized scarcity could later symbolize survival. A dish that once represented barely enough could later represent "we made it." And that emotional transformation gave these meals lasting significance. But perhaps the most surprising part is how those experiences changed people, even after circumstances improved. Because once someone has lived through real scarcity, their relationship with food changes. Waste becomes uncomfortable. Abundance feels fragile. Even when there is enough, part of the mind still remembers what it was like when there wasn't. That memory influences behavior in quiet ways. People save more, they stretch more, they value more, and often they pass those habits on. A child who grows up watching every crumb matter may carry that lesson for life. They may not fully understand where it came from, but the habit remains an instinct to protect resources. This is how survival experiences move through generations. Not always in stories, but in behavior. And sometimes the habits outlast the hardship itself. That's why the meals of 1933 matter beyond history. They show us how deeply circumstances shape the way people think, the way they act, and the way they define value. Because when people are forced to live with less, they learn to see more in what remains. A small meal becomes meaningful. A modest portion becomes enough, and gratitude becomes part of survival. That gratitude may have been quiet, but it was powerful. It wasn't gratitude for luxury. It was gratitude for continuity, for another day, for another meal, for another chance to keep going. And that perspective changes the emotional meaning of food entirely. Today, many people measure food by price, convenience, or variety. But in 1933, food was measured by what it made possible. Could it sustain the family? Could it stretch another day? Could it provide enough strength to continue? These questions gave food a purpose far beyond taste. And when you look at it this way, even the simplest meals become extraordinary. Because they were doing more than feeding hunger, they were supporting hope. Hope that tomorrow would be manageable. Hope that the next meal would come. Hope that this difficult season would not last forever. And hope, when everything else is uncertain, becomes one of the most valuable resources of all. That's why the story of $1 family meals is not really about poverty food. It's about human resilience. It's about the ability to adapt under pressure. It's about the creativity that appears when options disappear. And it's about the emotional strength required to keep finding ways forward. These meals tell a bigger story. A story about people refusing to surrender to circumstances. A story about making something meaningful out of almost nothing. A story about preserving dignity, connection, and hope, even when resources were painfully limited. And that story still matters today. Because while the specific circumstances may be different, the lessons remain relevant. Resourcefulness still matters. Gratitude still matters. The ability to adapt still matters. And perhaps most importantly, the reminder that strength often grows in the hardest conditions still matters. When you understand that, the image of a small, simple meal changes. It stops looking insignificant. It starts looking like evidence. Evidence of perseverance. Evidence of sacrifice. Evidence of love expressed through whatever was available. And maybe that is the most powerful lesson of all. Because in those difficult years, love often looked like a modest meal placed carefully on the table. Not because it was enough to solve everything, but because it was everything that could be given. And that made it priceless. As we move toward the final part of this journey, one question remains. What can these forgotten meals teach us now? Because the final chapter isn't just about history. It's about what this story reveals about human nature, about value, and about the way hardship can reshape the meaning of even the simplest things. Stay with this, because the final part brings the full meaning of these $1 meals into focus. And when you reach the end of this story, something becomes clear. These meals were never just about survival. They were about perspective, about how people chose to see what was in front of them, even when it felt like it wasn't enough. Because in 1933, families didn't have the luxury of waiting for better conditions. They had to work with what existed in that moment. And in doing so, they discovered something powerful, the ability to redefine enough. A meal didn't need to be perfect or complete. It just needed to serve its purpose. And that shift in thinking changed everything. It allowed people to move forward. Without constantly comparing their reality to what they had lost, they focused on what remained instead of what was missing. And that mindset wasn't easy. It required discipline, patience, and above all, it required acceptance. Acceptance that things were different now. Acceptance that comfort would look different. Acceptance that survival itself was something to be valued. But within that acceptance, something unexpected began to grow, a quiet appreciation for small things. A slightly fuller plate, a meal that tasted just a little better than usual, a day when no one had to go without. These moments may seem minor, but they carried real emotional weight because they represented progress. Even if it was slow, even if it was fragile, it was still progress. And that's what kept people moving forward. Not the promise of immediate change, but the possibility of gradual improvement. One better day than another. Over time, those small improvements began to add up. But even when conditions improved, the lessons didn't disappear. They stayed, quietly shaping the way people thought about food, about waste, and about value. Because once you've experienced a time when every resource mattered, it becomes difficult to take anything for granted again. A simple meal is no longer just routine. It's something to be respected. Leftovers are an opportunity, and abundance, when it comes, is no longer assumed, it's appreciated. These are not dramatic changes. They're subtle and lasting, and they show up in everyday decisions. In the way food is stored, shared, and valued. Memory plays a powerful role in how we understand the present. They remembered the uncertainty and the resilience, and the quiet determination that carried them through. Those memories gave meaning to even the simplest meals. A dish that once represented struggle could later represent strength. A flavor that once felt plain could later feel comforting, because it was connected to a story of endurance and adaptation. A story of finding a way forward when the path wasn't clear. That's what makes these $1 meals so important. They reveal something universal about how people respond to limited resources, how they adjust when circumstances change, and how they continue to build meaning even in difficult situations. At its core, this story isn't about the past. It's about human nature and the instinct to preserve dignity and connection. The desire to make the most of what we have. The effort to avoid waste and the appreciation for simple comfort. When you recognize that, the story of 1933 starts to feel connected. The lessons are still relevant today. They shape how we think, how we value, and how we respond when things don't go as planned. So the next time you sit down to a simple meal, it might be worth pausing for a moment to recognize the history behind it, to understand that even the most basic food carries a history of human resilience, a history of people who turned almost nothing into something, who proved that survival is not just about resources, it's about mindset. That's what these $1 meals truly represent. Not limitation, but transformation. A transformation in how people saw food, value, and themselves. If this story changed the way you see food, explore the channel for more stories that uncover the hidden meaning behind everyday life. Step into the next story, because sometimes the past has more to teach us than we expect.